Figuring out what varieties of vegetables to grow in the gardens has always been a bit of a strange process for me. I usually just end up looking at variety descriptions in catalogs or online, but that's not the best process. I prefer to follow recommendations from others, but many of the people that I've gotten recommendations from in the past don't grow in the same climate that I do, though this is improving. I also don't know how much work and explorations they would have put into their own variety selection process, and their biases and preferences might be quite different to mine. Over the years, I have tended to grow the same varieties season after season, but I doubt that they are the best ones to use, though occasionally I try different varieties, but typically when I'm not really pleased with what I've been able to produce. But lately I've started to do more systematic variety trials to gather up a wide range of different varieties and to grow them side by side in order to be able to compare them. Last year I did an extensive variety trial of tomatoes in my larger polytunnel, and I ended up growing 54 different varieties of tomato plants, which was really interesting and I learned a lot along the way. One of the main things that I learned is that if I'm going to do this kind of variety trial, I need to take it seriously and to do it well, and this trial could have been a lot better. 54 varieties was probably too many to keep track of, to be able to properly evaluate them all, especially in a year that was tough for many other reasons. And by trying to squeeze in all the varieties that I collected and growing 2 plants of each variety into 2 long beds of the polytunnel, I ended up growing them too close together, which I think caused problems, and I wasn't as consistent with the care, harvesting, and management as I should have been. I also grew the tomatoes as part of a relay intercrop with early summer crops, and this would have caused uneven competition between the different tomato plants. And I didn't sow the seeds of all the varieties at the same time. All of this means that I can't place too much emphasis on the data and observations of this one compromise trial, especially as I only grew 2 plants of each variety. I see this variety trial as an opportunity to sample a wide variety of different tomatoes, and to determine which ones I might be interested in growing in the future, or perhaps it's more of a process of narrowing down the number of varieties to determine which ones I'm not going to bother growing in the future. In trying to choose which varieties to keep or not, the taste of the different varieties is obviously an important factor, but different people have different taste preferences, and as I'm growing food for more than just myself, I need to be cautious of this. The taste of the tomato can also be affected by the health and growing conditions of the plant, and the observations that I made about the health and vigor of the different varieties was not so useful given the compromised nature of the trial, but it's still something to take into consideration. The diverse range of types and sizes of tomatoes is another thing to consider, as different sizes have different uses, and plants that produce earlier are valuable in this climate. But factors such as the ability of the fruit to survive packaging and transport is not so important in the context that I'm growing in. We did put in the time-consuming effort to weigh and harvest from the individual varieties, and assuming that not too many mistakes were made along the way, this data provides one key way in selecting varieties, and the only one I could really measure. The easiest way to start to evaluate the 54 different varieties would be to simply rank the overall harvest from highest to lowest, and select only the ones that produce the most. For example, if I only selected the varieties that produced over 2.5 kilograms per plant in this stress context, then that would leave me with 7 varieties, and it might be perfectly acceptable to just grow these varieties next year and not worry about the rest. But if I separated out the different varieties into broad categories based on size, then this shows that I would have selected 2 varieties that produce larger fruit, 5 that produced medium-sized fruit, and none of the cherry type of tomatoes. This makes sense that the smaller varieties would have difficulty matching the yield of the larger varieties, but I really like some of the smaller varieties, so it would be better to select a range from each broad category based primarily on the yield, but also on other factors. Looking at the set of cherry or smaller tomato varieties first, there was one variety that was blue which ripened into other colors, which I didn't really like the taste of, and it didn't produce very well, and it seems to be more of a novelty variety that I'm not really interested in growing again. 3 of the varieties produced cherry-type tomatoes that were brown or purple in color, and the skin of the fruit of 2 of them seemed to split quite often, and both plants seemed quite susceptible to blight. The splitting fruit contributed to the lower yields of these plants, and this was likely due to, in part, to the difficulty that I had in figuring out when these were ripe enough to pick because of their color. But I would be content to grow the one variety that did better and drop the other two because they were so similar. Another variety produced a fair amount of fruit, but almost all of it was split, more than in any of the other varieties, so I didn't end up harvesting or weighing much from these plants at all. Two varieties produced really small tomatoes that seemed to drop off the plant quite easily, so a lot of the crop was wasted, as I obviously didn't pick them regularly enough. Despite the low yield, I think it would be worth growing one of these varieties again, as they produce lots of very tasty, tiny tomatoes, and I'd probably pick the one that seemed to do a little bit better. Two varieties seem to be variations of the standard Gardener's Delight variety that I've been growing for years, which I didn't include in this side-by-side trial because of a lack of space, but I got a great crop from these plants and that I grew in my other polytunnel this season. And I'm not convinced that either of these two varieties is better, so I probably won't grow either of them again. Another two varieties produce very large trusses of huge numbers of small yellow fruit, and although the tomatoes are slightly different in size and shape, they are so similar that it isn't worth growing both, and I'd probably pick the one that I like the flavor of a little bit more. One variety also produced yellow fruit that was quite a bit larger and with a very different shape to the fruit, and produced enough to make it worth growing. Three of the small fruited varieties that I grew were hybrid plants, and each of them produced quite unique tomatoes. One I've grown before, and I think it may be the best tasting tomato of them all, something that this variety is famous for. The other two are quite unique shapes and tastes, which make them worth growing again for the sake of the diversity, especially one of them that was quite interesting shape and produced a slightly higher yield. The three remaining varieties of cherry tomatoes all produce the highest yields of nice tasting fruit from quite strong and vigorous plants, which are definitely worth growing again. So out of the set of 18 cherry-type varieties, I think I would grow 9 of them again, in addition to my old favorite Gardener's Delight, if I had the space to grow them all, as they would produce a wide variety of shapes, colors, and tastes, even if this meant a slightly lower overall yield compared to some of the larger fruited plants. 23 of the varieties that I grew I would place in the category of producing medium-sized fruit, though it's hard to determine the boundary between these categories, and they are generally higher yielding than the cherry types, with perhaps a greater diversity of size and color and flavor. Looking at the yields of each variety, about half did quite well, and the other half were mediocre or poor, and at first glance I would be tempted to select the 12 that produce the most, as they seem to offer good diversity, but it's worth taking a closer look. Some varieties produce a very low yield for some reason, perhaps they're just not suitable for the context. Another 2 varieties had damage to one of the plants, which may have reduced their yield significantly. They may be worth trying again, but there are other options, and I wasn't overly impressed with their flavor. One variety produced blue tomatoes, which faded when the fruit ripened, and I definitely wouldn't bother to grow it again as I didn't like the taste. Another 3 varieties were interesting enough, and it might be worth growing again if their yields were better. 2 varieties didn't have a very big yield, but they produced ripe fruit significantly earlier in the season than any of the other varieties, which makes them worth growing, and of the 2 of them I'd be tempted to select one of them, possibly because it had a more interesting name. And 2 varieties which produced a moderate yield I found relatively quite tasteless and uninteresting. Of the remaining larger yielding varieties, 3 typically had a slightly unripe part of the fruit, which I'm not very fond of, and although it may produce a lot, I'm not impressed enough to grow them again. 2 of the varieties are more of a paste tomato, and it might be worth growing them, but I don't think they really belong in this selection of more salad types of tomatoes. One variety produced a big yield of nice tomatoes over a long part of the season, and it might be the variety that I would select if I could only grow one. But there are another 6 varieties that produced well and taste nice and have a different color and flavor than the others. Some were yellow or orange, or quite dark, or multicolored, including a green and yellow variety even when ripe, and one was really pale. If I was going for visual diversity, I would be sure to grow this set of 6 again, and if I included the 2 typically red or early producing varieties, I would be tempted to grow all 8 varieties again if I had the space. With the selection of 13 larger tomato varieties, there is quite a significant difference in yield. With one variety, I seemed to keep missing when the fruit was ripe, probably because of its color, and they tended to split and start to rot on the vine. Two varieties just didn't seem to produce a lot of fruit clusters, even though they were quite vigorous vines, including a paste type of tomato, and I suspect that they needed more heat or perhaps more space. One hybrid variety produced a lot of larger fruit later in the season, but very few of them ripened before the weather turned cold, so that was not very useful. Another variety was actually a mislabeled determinant or bush variety, and I won't be growing it again in this context at least. Of the 6 remaining moderately yielding varieties, I would probably not grow 2 of them because I wasn't so fond of the taste. One variety had quite interesting colored fruit that tasted really good, and another one with very interesting and tasty green fruit that would probably have produced more if I hadn't accidentally damaged one of the plants. And both of these varieties would be worth growing again, even just for more diversity of color. I really like the flavor of 2 of them, with one of them possibly being my favorite tomato variety out of the whole selection, and I wish it had produced a lot more, but perhaps I need more space and attention. The remaining 2 varieties both produced lots of really big tomatoes and had significantly higher yields than any of the other varieties, and they both seemed to be more of a paste type of tomato, but they also tasted quite good raw. Of all of the varieties of tomatoes that I grew in this cramped space of this larger polytunnel last year, I would like to grow 6 of the larger, 8 of the medium, and 9 of the smaller or cherry type of varieties of tomatoes again. This gives me 23 out of the 54 varieties that I would like to try again, in addition to the 3 varieties that I didn't have room for but grew in my other polytunnel last year. I am just about to start to sow seeds for the season, and I think that these 26 varieties is more than enough to grow for a second trial, though I might try to squeeze in a few other new varieties this year. For the 31 varieties that didn't make the cut, some of these might be really good in a different context, and perhaps I will try them again at some other point in the future. But this season, I want to grow fewer varieties, with more space between the plants, and with the aim of being more focused with the trial, and to see how all the varieties compare with better growing conditions. I'm not really sure where it will all go after that. I could continue with another few years of variety trials to try to refine down the selection to a few key varieties that do really well in this context, and then to focus on growing lots of those smaller selection of tomatoes into the future. But I also quite like the idea of continuing to grow a really wide variety of tomatoes, and there's so many other varieties out there to try. And I think that the world needs more people maintaining a localized seed collection that has that kind of diversity, and perhaps this seed-saving role is something that I could take on in the future, and possibly even getting into breeding new and additional varieties. But with several different possible options for the future, a lot depends on how well the variety trial goes this year.